The King of the Battlefield Chapter 181. Chapter 181, The Traces of Diablo, 4. Translation, Nadu. Edit, Lee Suris. A giant body. If it wasn't Muyung, it wouldn't be possible to catch it with just a crude fishing rod. Like the technique of riding the river on a leaf, the technique of reeling in the catch required complete control of your strength, but to Muyung it was as easy as breathing. The guardian of the spring of light, Ballon d'Or. However, what interested Muyung were the words that popped up. For it to be the guardian of the spring of light. Did you just catch fishes that were in sync with the person fishing at the spring of light? Or it might mean that only it was the only fish that was able to handle Muyung. Because he wasn't sure, he tossed his rod once again and instantly, a fish started to bite. After Ballon d'Or was caught, the next fish was its baby. The size of the baby fish was only up to Muyung's shoulders. Gulp. Gulp. Ballon d'Or continuously moved its mouth. When Muyung caught its baby, its movement became more violent. It was surprising for a fish to have a name but for it to be a guardian. Muyung spoke as he released its baby. I need you to be the sacrifice. Although it might be a guardian, it was no more than a sacrifice as it was caught for that use. The results might be worthwhile to look forward to if the fish he had caught was this great to be used as a sacrifice for the blessing of a moon. Grey. The Ballon d'Or tried to go back into the spring as it moved its body. It was like a last-ditch effort. But, because it was so big, even the ground shook. I should make it unconscious before I take it back. Muyung lightly clenched his fist and punched Ballon d'Or's side. Thud! Ballon d'Or's side curved in quite a bit. At the same time, Ballon d'Or's body stretched out. Muyung grabbed Ballon d'Or's tail. Thump! Then, he started to move as it dragged on the ground. Gulp! With her eyes widened, Anne raised her head. As if she couldn't believe her eyes when she saw Ballon d'Or. This was also the same for other elves in the surrounding. Ballon d'Or! Oh my gosh! For the guardian of the spring. The elves thought highly of Ballon d'Or. The reason was simple. Few hundred years ago, before Shandalton started to live at this place, Ballon d'Or had lived at this spring. It was the oldest and most mysterious fish that no one had caught. So, the elves even gave food to Ballon d'Or whenever they went to the spring to pray. But now, that mystery had been solved. The mysterious fish that no one could catch and instead ate up 20,000 people who tried to catch it was right now shown in front of everyone in broad daylight. How did you catch it? How did he catch it? Muyung handed his fishing rod. You caught it with this fishing rod? That can't be possible. High Elf Anne was still in disbelief. Did she think Muyung had forcibly caught Ballon d'Or? It was better to show them than to explain it to them. He once again tossed the fishing rod he held. Then with a thud sound, the rock on the other side was pierced through. In conclusion, it was about movement and the balance of strength. Muyung was very confident in the movement and balance of strength. As he needed to do those things well in order to hide his body and erase his presence. However, Anne still couldn't say anything. She also knew that Muyung didn't use any magical powers or any other tricks. A fishing rod made out of bamboo pierced through a huge rock and popped out on the other side. Logically, it wasn't possible. Muyung slightly frowned as he pointed towards Ballon d'Or. Offering. We can't sacrifice the guardian as an offering. You said that you would sacrifice what I caught. I certainly did say that, but, for this to happen, all mountains, rivers, etc. had owners. Ballon d'Or was the owner of this spring of light. Although Shandalton took his spot, that didn't really change anything. And by looking at the nature of elves who lived around the spring of light, it seemed like they couldn't kill and sacrifice Ballon d'Or, and only could thank it. Of course, he was going to understand their respect for it, but they couldn't force the same thing to Muyung. As for Muyung, Ballon d'Or was just a slightly big fish. Its baby is already in the spring. If I can't sacrifice Ballon d'Or, I shall sacrifice its baby. It was the only compromise he was going to make. If Ballon d'Or was the guardian, its baby was just a slightly big fish. However, it still morally troubled their minds. Elves couldn't do one thing or another. Growl. Then, the awakened Ballon d'Or cried loudly. The guardian says to use it as a sacrifice. Anne, who raised one of her ears, started to speak. Myung spoke as he grinned. Did you understand it? It is mind communication. Mind communication. It was like understanding of the opponent. High elves had high empathy. As they tend to accept everything from their opponents, they normally died fast. That was also the reason why there were only a very few of them in number. Normally, high elves were limited to people or animals, but Anne seemed to be able to communicate even with a fish. You take care of the rest. Myung turned his back. Now was the time for him to retract the footsteps of Diablo. He went around the spring once. However, he was unable to feel anything that resembled his footsteps. Although I can't feel it, the fire dragons can. Until now, Anne and the elves stopped the fire dragons with their strength. However, the fire dragons were continuously after the spring and attacked. It meant that they were after something specific. And it was highly likely that it was related to Diablo. Nevertheless, it wasn't like he could just wait for the fire dragons to appear. A rest in a while was definitely great, but to Myung, rest was virtually torture. Pa! Snow leaped around Myung. After eating up a young fire dragon, she was more energetic. The red wings that appeared caught his eyes more. Do you know what the fire dragons are looking for? Snow ate a fire dragon. Perhaps she might know what the fire dragons were after. However, it was a bit awkward to ask. It was because he was still unsure how to deal with Snow. Of course, he didn't have much expectation. After she was born again, everything was reset for Snow. Her memories and her ability to speak didn't return to normal. There were a lot of times when she couldn't even understand Myung's words. Snow stopped for a moment. Pa! Pa! Then, she grabbed Myung's hand and started to move. Did she understand? Myung moved and for now acted as Snow wanted him to. Through instinctive attractions, the fire dragon Muspel settled near the spring of light. The attraction that led it. It wasn't only for Muspel. There were at least 10 fire dragons that gathered near this place. They also arrived near the spring of light as they followed their instincts like Muspel. However, Muspel tried his best to contain its instinct. It was because he was quite older than other dragons. He was an adult dragon that lived for thousands of years. On top, there was a need to approach the spring more carefully. For there to be such a high elf. The high elf in the spring of light was strong. It was difficult for one dragon to attack. But, the dragons didn't normally work together. They existed and acted on their own. If they gathered their strength, they would have already conquered the spring of light. However, they had no thoughts of doing so. Not too long ago, a young fire dragon had died. All the fire dragons knew that one among them had been killed at the spring of light. He was unsure if the elves killed it or something else, but this was important information. So, Muspel gathered all the creatures in the surrounding. The numbers that were gathered reached a certain level. It hurts my pride to fight mere elves, but Muspel wanted to find out what was leading him here. To do this, he needed to know how to remove a bit of pride. If it was a fire dragon with a brain like Muspel, they would also do the same thing. If there are this many in number, we can just wipe out all the elves. Muspel was pleased. Either way, he did gather fighting power and he would be able to gain a result faster than other fire dragons. Kiyaak! Shayake! It was at that moment. From afar, he was able to hear cries of monsters. Muspel spread its wings. And ran out of his dwelling and went towards where the screaming came from. That is. Pa! Pa! Clap clap clap. A girl clapped her hands. A human was slaughtering monsters with a sword. Bastard! They were monsters he scraped up. He literally gathered all the monsters in his surrounding. The monsters that were supposed to face the elves were dying off by the hands of some unknown human. How could Muspel not get mad? On top, he was a fire dragon. Once he got mad, he needed to release his anger. Blaze! He let out a breath of fierce fire. The breath of Muspel, who lived thousands of years, could erase even a mountain. Oh dear, I was too worked up. The problem was due to this, he burned up all the surrounding monsters. Almost 100 monsters burned with only their bones left. It was when Muspel was planning to head back after believing he had repelled the invader. You have led me to a fire dragon, and not Diablo. Muspel looked into the flames. As the man stretched out his hand, he sucked in all of Muspel's flames into his hand. Muspel was able to see it. The appearance of his flames flowing and absorbing into the man's body as if it was nutrients to him. How dare he absorb his flames? Kaya! Muspel burned up. He let out a horrible shriek and once again breathed out. This time, he didn't look back. Maximum output. His breath really did have the powers to even blast off a mountain. Tasty. However, the man was fine. He wasn't just fine, he even made a remark about the flames as he tasted it with his tongue. It was tasty? Not painful or scary, but tasty? Muspel was dumbfounded. His ego took a hit. What's with that man? It was the first time he experienced something like this. There was rarely anyone who survived after they received his breath while he was living for thousands of years. Even more, there weren't any who absorbed his flames. Afterwards, the man looked at Muspel and spoke. Fire dragon hunting isn't bad at all. The man smacked his lips. At the same time, the man jumped up. No, when Muspel thought he jumped up, the man stood beside him. 3 pairs of grey wings spread as it spread light. Thud. Muspel's body greatly shook. It was painful. His body let out a cry. His scales were torn off and his flesh was dug out. Although he was just hit once, he was able to feel the difference in their strength. He isn't a human. Even though Muspel thought the man was human, by looking at the wings that sprouted, he could never be human. The man wasn't anything at all. Muspel was unable to figure out what he was. However, the flames within Muspel shivered. He quickly used magic to the light of tens of thousands of flames into the surrounding. Explosions of light that exploded on impact and ripped apart bodies. This type of flame was Muspel's specialty. There wasn't anyone who pierced through his explosions of fire. But, the thing he faced fearlessly held one of the flames that were thrown and grabbed it with his hand. And swallowed it as is. Gulp. This flame tastes like really fermented kimchi. The flame didn't explode. The moment he swallowed it, it instantly became nutrients. Even further, he kept making remarks about the taste of the flames. Although Muspel didn't know what fermented kimchi was, this was unheard of. The unknown was fear. Muspel hasn't felt fear in a very long time. That was right. The man seemed to be fire itself. Muspel felt like the man was closer to its essence than a fire dragon like himself. Muspel spread his wings and began to run away. Chapter 182, The Traces of Diablo, End. Translation, Te. Edit, no one yet. Hopefully someone soon. Muspel was astonished. Even his speed was no match. His main skills also didn't work at all. The current Muyang was like the fire dragon's natural enemy. The power flowing from Muyang's small frame was even stronger than the power of Muspel's overwhelmingly large body. Moreover, unless the flame was exceedingly pure, it would not damage Muyang at all. This fellow is a dangerous guy. It was truly fire magic. He might be the god of fire. Although there was no match for a dragon's fire because of its purity, it was a mistake that his opponent was Muyong of all people. A type of foe he had never encountered before. Muspel, who felt threatened, racked his brains. The heart of a dragon was filled with power. It was the same as the origin of a dragon. After all, if a dragon of Muspel's caliber squeezed out the power of his heart, its destructive power would be beyond imagination. Shudder. For a short moment, gooseflesh rose on Muyong's entire body. His instincts were telling him that this fire would be dangerous if it hit him directly. However, Muyong smiled all the more. I wonder what it will taste like. It was the power from giving his all. Every cell of his heart and body was trying to oppose Muyong. What would that kind of flame taste like? Muyong was not a gourmet connoisseur, but he was suddenly curious. This was because it was an unfamiliar experience. And Muyong didn't view this novelty negatively. On the contrary, the many experiences of failure helped him to make his Muyong sword. Kwa-a-a-a-a-a. Muspel shot off an intense flame. It was more like a beam than a flame. The sky shook and the clouds were penetrated as it reached Muyong. It might be dangerous to be hit directly, but to sum it up, it would be okay as long as he wasn't hit directly. Muyong's divine flame blazed. He then rotated it around himself. Fire attracts fire. The setting of a counter-fire. Muyong used his thorn formation skill despite this. Thorn formation was a skill that decreased agility but in exchange, greatly increased physical and magical resistance. Then he wrapped himself in Gabriel's wings. Kwa-a-a. The fire dragon, Muspel, gushed flames perpetually. However, Muyong was not overpowered. The flames that had been flying in a straight line were blocked by Muyong and split in two. There was gradual overheating, but not to an extent that he couldn't withstand it. It's delicious. In the meantime, Muyong was savoring the flavor of the flames Muspel shot. There was a little strain on his body, but when he tasted Muspel's flames all his worries were forgotten at once. In addition, his skin absorbed the flames then shrank and expanded repeatedly. Surprisingly, Muspel's real flame tasted like smoked pork. There was also the ecstatic feeling of eating when one was extremely hungry. Taste calibration effect? There's all sorts of things. Muyong couldn't help but grin. The taste Muyong experienced was incomparable next to that of a true gourmet connoisseur, however, all his stats had gone up by 1. If he tasted and felt many things, he was more likely to get additional effects. How could my essence be stopped? After spewing out all of his flames, Muspel was in despair. The fire's essence was no different from the final move, or the hidden move. However, it had been blocked. Also, it had been blocked from the front. Muspel's ego suffered a severe blow and he was forced to feel even more terror. It's over. Muyong released his thorn formation skill. There seemed to be no more flavor to be gained from the fire dragon. However, there was much to be gained from this fire dragon's corpse. It's not ancient class, but it's the level right beneath that. The ancient classes were not common, so it seemed he should be satisfied with this much. Furthermore, none of the dragons that took part in this event seemed to be of the ancient class. If there were, no matter how strong High Elf Anne was, she would not have been able to stop them. As such, the gap between general and ancient dragons was huge. The ancient class. It meant that a dragon had aged at least 10,000 years. Dragons shed their bodies once again depending on their age. You could say that they shed their last scales. Although gaps existed with such ancient dragons, they were so strong they were incomparable to normal adult dragons. If the quality isn't good, I have to go with quantity. In no time, Muyong was calculating the quality of the dragon. It was a novel experience for a dragon to see him and run away. Maybe it was because he had already surpassed the strength of his past life. Although they weren't exciting, it was clear that there was a wider range of choices to choose from. Swung. Muyong unsheathed anguish and gripped it. At the same time, a huge horn rose on top of his head. It looked like Diabolo's mountain goat horn. 32 times. He could maintain it for less than 1 second at best. However, the time Weung could feel was more than 30 seconds. Anguish danced. And then about 20 seconds later, the acceleration was released. Kwaak! Muspel screamed. Kwaak! All over his body, his scales were penetrated, and blood spurted from hundreds of thousands of holes. Even a dragon would die if he suffered this level of damage. This is still a bit difficult. 32 times was too fast. Weung's body could barely withstand it. I need more strength or stamina. To use it properly, he would have to increase his strength and stamina stats. He only accelerated for about 20 seconds, but his body was filled with pain. Thud. Soon, Muspel's enormous body slammed into the ground. Weung slowly flew over it and reached out his hand. The Art of Death. Name, Muspel. Strength, 495, Agility, 480, Stamina, 510. Intelligence, 450, Wisdom, 450, Fire Attribute, 550. Magical Resistance, 550. Tendency, Firebone Dragon. Overall level, 510. Plus ability to use Flame Cresting, Flame Baptism, High-Speed Flight, and Fire Dragon Breath skills. His skin burned and fell off. A powerful flame was laid around the bone dragon, of which only the skeleton remained. Qoo. As if saluting his birth, the bone dragon spewed flames. Indeed. Weung nodded his head contentedly. The first. And because of the calibration effect of the skill rank, Muspel was stronger than he was when he'd been alive. If it hadn't been the first time, the overall level would not have exceeded 500. This is not the end. Weung looked at Snow, who was far away from him. Pa. He didn't really care, but it seemed that Snow had taken a direct hit. The clothes on her entire body were half burnt. However, there was no effect on her body. Is it because she absorbed the dragon? Snow ate a whole fire dragon. As a result, a red wing also flew out. It wasn't strange that her flame resistance was so high. Her half-burned clothes suggested that she had not taken a direct hit. Even if she had devoured a fire dragon, she would not have been safe if she had been shot directly with Muspel's essence. Blasé. Snow hurriedly made her way to Weung's side and opened her mouth wide. Then, a small flame came out of her mouth. Cough. Cough. It seemed like an imitation of a dragon, but that was all. Weung spoke to Snow. Where is the next fire dragon? Before he knew it, Snow became Weung's detector. Quantity if not quality. Literally. Weung didn't wait. Why wait for the enemy to come when he had a detector that could find fire dragons? Rather, it was better for him to go. And that way he could hunt easier. Dragons didn't unite well and clearly tended to avoid each other. The Art of Death. He reached out his hand to the corpse of a dead fire dragon. Then, black energy came out of Weung's hand and surrounded the fire dragon. Fire Dragon Throng, S, has been completed. Summoning all at once has the additional effect of raising all dragons' ability stats by +5. S. Title, Death Shepherd King. Class, S. Effect, Power of Death +50. Strengthens undead according to the Power of Death ability. 0.1% per 4, and 12.5% at 500. 5 fire dragons that were surrounded in flames roamed around Weung. There were now 5 spots remaining. Apparently, he couldn't make an unlimited number of dragon monsters into an undead. Indeed, if it had been possible, thus far Weung would have been searching for tombs where corpses were instead of becoming stronger and killing enemies. Bone Dragon. A top-ranking undead. Certainly, the strength needed in creating and maintaining undead was extraordinary. However, rather than that, the new complete victory effect that he'd gained caught Muyoung's eye. Death Shepherd King. Did this mean he now possessed a king's army? The name itself was not ordinary. In addition, the spirit of death had changed to power of death and had gained additional benefits. Since the spirit ability was about 450, it would now be over 500 if these 50 points were added. It meant that the abilities of the undead that Muyoung had just created and those he owned would increase by 12 to 13%. There are still around 5 more left. Muyoung's gaze was different. It shone more deeply. It wasn't just about 10%. It was as much as 10%. 12 to 13% was not to be thought of lightly. The stronger the species and the higher the ability, the brighter the effect. This was because if the ability exceeded 500, then the difference of 1 would no longer be a simple difference of 1. 12% could become 24%. That was why he had to make a strong monster into an undead. Of course, it would have been perfect if there had been an ancient dragon, but this much was enough to satisfy him. Also, this meant that the majority of Muyoung's undead was able to receive much more privilege. Not 500, but Muyoung had quite a few undead that exceeded ability scores of 400. Muyoung made the 5th dragon into a bone dragon and moved on. It was at that moment Muyoung sensed something strange and turned around. Wah-ah-ah-ah-ah-ah. At the same time, a huge pillar of fire shot up from the fountain of light. The pillar of fire reached the sky and was large enough to swallow the entire fountain. Muyoung wiped his chin at the sight. The power felt from the pillar of fire itself was unusual. It wasn't difficult to identify the pillar of fire because it was familiar and somehow he felt a kinship with it. The footprints left by Diablo. The thing he had searched for but had not been able to find. Unable to find it, Muyoung had gone fishing for it. Then, he went on a fire dragon hunting expedition. But that was exactly what Muyoung had been after. Something left by Diablo. It was the mark that he was passing by. He couldn't believe that Diablos would actually show up there. Muyoung was very grateful for this. Chapter 183, Fire Spirit King Ifrit, 1. Translation, Te. Edit, Sefter. It was not an ordinary explosion. A great explosion. Due to the extreme purity of the flame, something was summoned along with a crack. The thing that was summoned also had a pure but shapeless flame. It was truly the essence of fire itself. It came from a place in the depths of a fountain. The thing that existed, not within the spring, but further inside the ground had now come onto the surface. It was reasonable for Muyoung to not notice. Ah! Fire Spirit King Ifrit. Anne's eyes shook. There were countless spirits, but the Spirit Kings had been named since ancient times. The Fire Spirit King always used the name Ifrit. As the name was inherited indefinitely, the power of a Spirit King was strong. However, thus far, there were no instances of a Spirit King being summoned into the underworld. Diablo was irregular. He was also a being that never used to exist in the underworld. The being that created variables by making cracks was precisely Diablo. And Ifrit was one of the variables created by Diablo. Intentionally or not, he was summoned to follow Diablo's fire. Following the whisper of the moon, Anne could identify the Spirit King's existence at a glance. Wah-ah-ah-ah. There was no comparing it to the flame of a mere fire dragon. A flame that set everything on fire. She didn't dare even think of approaching it. Creak. Craok. Countless spirits sprang out from the Great Divide. Spirits from the lowest class to the highest, of a number expected to be in the thousands. O Spirit King! For what reason have you descended to this place? The Spirit King was the reason for the fire dragon's raid on this place. Even though Diablo's flames were hidden beneath the fountain, the fire dragons were instinctively attracted to its matchless purity. Anne was in a hurry. At this rate, it would be the end of the Spring of Light. The people who had conquered and were living in this place would walk the path to extinction once and for all. So Anne stood in front of the Great Divide. She was a high elf. Her communication skills were extremely exceptional. The spirits did not attack her. Instead, a large man appeared in front of her. His stature appeared to be way above 2 m. His muscles were covered in long red hair, and his entire body was blazing. His flames craved destruction. Who the hell is he? Why does he want to burn everything? I was summoned following his flames, and the contract was completed. In the future, many more unusual things will be summoned besides me. Pitiful high elf, does that answer suffice? Ifrit respected Anne, the top-ranking high elf. Naturally, whatever was in front of him would have burned up instantly, but the high elf could interact with everything. Of course, it was possible to communicate with Ifrit in some way. And Anne saw Ifrit's inner craving for destruction. The appetite for destruction was not Ifrit's. It belonged to he who had contracted him. However, the craving was so strong that even Ifrit was infected. Truly terrifying. Gulp. Anne swallowed her saliva. At that moment, she knew that nothing would work. Be prudent, I beg of you. I give you my life, so please spare just my tribe. She fell to her knees. Anne was that desperate. The destruction of the Spring of Light was determined once Ifrit decided to do so. Furthermore, everything in the area would start to burn. However, there was a little bit of hope that they could avoid the effects of the fire. At the very least, the tribe's elves could survive and get out. However, Ifrit refused. I am going to burn it all. No one can escape my fire. Ifrit had infinite confidence in his flame. The number of spirits that came out reached 100,000. Spirits continued to crawl out of the Great Divide. This kind of military power was of a standard close to the 7 mountains. It referred to the demon kings that possessed 7 enormous mountains. There were 3 criteria for classifying the highest grade demon kings. 7 mountains. 6 lords. 5 stars. In that number alone, even among the demon kings, only the most outstanding 18 met the criteria. Among those, 7 mountains was the lowest, but it couldn't be ignored. Some people described it as 7 mountains, 6 lords, 5 stars, but it meant that his influence was that strong. I beg you. Anne saw Ifrit's craving for destruction. She knew that he would never stop. Even so, Anne could not stop either. Soon, a huge fireball shot up along Ifrit's hand. The fireball emitted a light as bright as the sun. Everyone that had been watching closed their eyes, and at the same time, Ifrit threw the fireball. Ah! Anne screamed and closed her eyes. The string was pulled. Now there was no one who could stop Ifrit. Swayak! But the explosion did not happen. Only the sound of a strong wind filled the air. Then Anne, who sensed something strange, opened her eyes. A man stood in front of her, with a long sword clenched in his hand. Lord Myung. She couldn't believe it. Myung was a foreigner. Furthermore, she thought of him as an ancient dragon. Dragons were not the kind to take pleasure in adventure. If it was not even their territory, they would not risk danger. She was assuming that Myung had already departed. Even so, Myung had stopped Ifrit. Also, he was not alone. There were 5 undead around him. Kai-a-a-a-a-a. The fire-bone dragons screeched. The shapeless spirits were biting and swallowing while using fire to defend against fire. Strange. I can feel his fire coming from you. Even Ifrit hesitated. The familiar energy that he felt coming from Myung definitely belonged to him. But Myung was a completely different being to him, to Diabolo. Diabolo is also my prey. You are merely the process. Myung said in a taciturn manner. When Diabolo's name was mentioned, Ifrit looked at Myung with interest. Your fire is pure, but it cannot match even mine. I am the king of all fire. He didn't deny it. Myung simply had no intention of beating him with fire alone. Of course, he intended to use all of his powers to knock him down. For example, getting rid of the fireball by seeing the grain and using anguish's power. There is a grain in everything. In fact, for Muyang, fire was only the beginning of his secondary abilities. An unfamiliar power that he had only just acquired. However, Muyang's true power was in none other than this one sword. Swung! Anguish cried. The castle closest to the Fountain of Light. A noble castle. Most of the nobility were concentrated in the noble castle. The noble castle was the only place comparable to the great city. The words floated up for all the people residing there. Ifrit. Is Diablo the cause this time too? It's non-stop. The people who saw the words clicked their tongues. They accepted it as if this type of thing hadn't just happened once or twice. In fact, there were many monsters that were summoned because of Diablo. In cases where clearing it was possible, unimaginable rewards were received. However, there were more than 5 cities that had disappeared because they were unable to suppress it. Even more, the bastards didn't only attack places where people were. There were also monsters that entered the demon gods' territories and attacked the residents. Daing! Bells rang everywhere. It was a call to order for those belonging to clans to return. It was for the immediate suppression of Ifrit. If this type of matter was finished quickly, it would be good. There were many cases where things became more complicated if time dragged on. What will happen to this world? But didn't Diablo cause a demon god to go extinct? Ors. He was also a demon god that handled fire. It seemed that what Diablo wanted was really the destruction of the world. He had destroyed 5 cities, and even worse, he had killed Ors. Diablo had no enemies or allies. Therefore he was even more dangerous. It made his future actions completely unpredictable. It was like walking past a nuclear bomb. Thud. Are you blind or something? Gasp. At that moment, a peddler bumped into a man whose body was covered in a shabby cloak. However, the moment the peddler saw the man's eyes, he backed away in fright. The man in the shabby cloak only revealed 2 black pupils. Be careful. The peddler fled as if escaping. The man loitered around unconcernedly. The Fountain of Light. The man adjusted the long sword at his waist. Then, he left the noble city and headed in the direction of the Fountain of Light. It has already been 2 years. As soon as he was out of the noble castle, the man took off his cloak. Then, there was no flesh on the body that was revealed. Only bones. A death knight composed of only bones. He was none other than Taken. Where are you? 2 years had passed since his owner Muyang had disappeared. 2 years later, the strong discipline that had tied them together had also weakened. The connection between them had also slackened. However, all the undead, starting with Taken, were looking for Muyang. Muyang was their master and their goal. There were few undead that followed Muyang without a story. Taken especially interfered in all activity involving Diablo. However, 2 years had already passed, and he had been unable to find Muyang's whereabouts. However, he never thought Muyang was dead. No one did. No matter what, Muyang would not die. He was like an immortal. I have now become strong enough to have a match with you. Taken had grown rapidly in 2 years. He found and sparred with the people that were called strong and absorbed everything from them. Even worse, a considerable number of those who were called 10 strongest had met Taken. However, Muyang, who was his true objective, had disappeared and thrown him away. He couldn't give up until he fought this match properly. Thud. Gabriel's spear stuck into the ground. Gabriel's spear was not a physical substance. There was a prophecy, but Muyang already had it. Muyang had awakened Gabriel's spear on Suicide Hill, so the prophecy could not have been a lie. At any rate, Gabriel's spear had transformed into a powerful skill that could suppress an opponent. As the spear stuck into the ground, all the spirits stopped moving. The only things that could move unimpeded in this space were Muyang and Ifrit. The top-class spirits tried to move under the restrictions, but the 5 fire bone dragons blocked them. Swung! Anguish moved leisurely. Like that, it flowed freely again in one moment, and then quickly advanced. It seemed to be dancing, but it was brutally practical. It was incredibly free. All grains were within range of the Muyeong sword. The Muyeong sword had found a rival for the first time. Are you the one who reached extremity? Ifrit was impressed. He was fire. He was that pure. When it reached extremity, everything was pure. He spoke with a sense of kinship and awe. But Muyeong grinned. Extremity? It's still a long way off. The Muyeong sword was still incomplete. If all Muyeong's knowledge, the knowledge from Gabriel's spear and the senses awakened by pure fire were combined, it would only be about 50%. The remaining half was being made. Perhaps this number was also incorrect. To that extent, there were no limits to the sword that Muyeong made. I hope. A smiling Muyeong looked at Ifrit. And he spoke with a matchlessly urgent expression. You don't fall until I have finished wielding my sword. Chapter 184, Fire Spirit King Ifrit, End. Translation, Nadu. Edit, Lisuris and Sefter. Muyeong's sword was a swordsmanship made up of a total of 100 strikes. Muyeong had finished 50 strikes among them. Would Ifrit be able to withstand all 50 strikes? Muyeong was curious. How powerful was the swordsmanship he had created? He had created this swordsmanship by combining all his knowledge, the experience he had gained at Diablo's altar, and the fire and Gabriel's spear he had earned. There were lots of things he had gained, but among them, his most favorite of them all was, of course, Muyeong's sword. The swordsmanship that contained Muyeong's life itself. Enlightenment is like an instant. However, to reach enlightenment, it took a long time. Within the source of fire, Muyeong had been wandering around for a long time. He fought with the evil that resided inside him, and after wandering for a long time, he had now found his place. Quite a bit of time in the real world would have passed as well. From now on, Muyeong was going to correct all his past mistakes. The mistakes that he made and those made by humanity, everything. Although he couldn't say all the things he did were correct. Muyeong, I'm different from you. I'll live my own life. In the past, when Muyeong was Yoyoung, there was another Muyeong that existed within his memories before he was brainwashed. Although he had died in this life due to Muyeong, Muyeong didn't have any regrets or guilt. As he also would want that from him. However, Muyeong wasn't planning to die again. He wasn't planning to give up what he had either. Infinite freedom. Muyeong could become anything. You are that first step. He swung his sword. Swoosh! Anguish cried. Anne's eyes widened. She couldn't believe it. The fire spirit was not in a bad relationship with the fire dragons. If he was an ancient fire dragon, it was normal for him to not fight a being like the fire spirit king. That should be the case, but the two were crazily fighting each other. Even more, the fire spirit king was the one lacking. Who is this person? She had never seen that sort of swordsmanship. She did see a couple of people who were considered geniuses in swordsmanship, but they were not even close to Muyeong's swordsmanship. Only then did Anne change her thoughts. That person wasn't a fire dragon. A horn, wings, fire, and sword, a spear that could stop the movements of spirits, and bone dragons. She had never seen anyone that possessed this much power before. Truly a being greater than a dragon. Among them, the real deal was, of course, the sword. It was like the sword owner himself. Muyeong restlessly wielded his sword. If you considered each move, it wasn't that threatening, but, as if he was drawing a picture, it was flexible and elegant swordsmanship. Even Anne, who didn't know of swordsmanship, was able to understand that when the picture was completed, even Spirit King Ifrit won't be able to survive this. Ha! Anne turned her head as she was startled. Someone beside her had let out a sigh. Even if she was unprepared, for her to not notice until the person stood next to her. She was a high elf. She received the moon's blessing. Even if someone was to move secretly in the dark, she was able to know all about it. However, the man that approached her from the side didn't show any presence. She couldn't feel life within him. Like a ghost. Death Knight. Yes, it was no different than a ghost. An undead made out of just bones. A Death Knight which was known to be one of the strongest undead was standing beside Anne. However, it wasn't a normal Death Knight. In the past, Anne had seen a few Death Knights who controlled liches. They were clearly strong, but they couldn't pressure Anne. As Anne was strong enough to face most ancient dragons. However, the Death Knight in front of her was different. Bastard! I was wondering where you went, but you were staying at a place like this. The Death Knight shook his head. At the same time, Anne's empathy skill was fully demonstrated. Unlike his tone, she felt his joy. This feeling was like seeing a cat who just reunited with his owner. He wasn't an enemy. Rather, he was the opposite. Anne was able to notice that the one the Death Knight thought of as his enemy was, instead, Ifrit. Blaaz. Anne turned his head. Red lights were pouring over Muyong's head. An owner of a star. Star of the Absolute. It was also different from the past. The red light was much stronger. Anne couldn't help but close her eyes as she saw the intense light that spanned the whole spring. You will die if you stay still. The Death Knight advised her. Anne opened her eyes and at the same time, the Death Knight wielded his sword. Slash! The spirit was sliced. Numerous spirits were slowly moving. The Death Knight, Taken, was not going to stay still and watch. Although it's annoying, it seems like he has created his own sword. Although he wasn't smiling, he looked like he was smiling. If he was a living being, he would have trembled with excitement. Slash! A half-translucent spirit was sliced by Taken's sword. Taken's sword was like a very tightly knitted web. He restrained a few dozen, a few hundred spirits in his area and hunted them. A swordsman who was at his peak. Taken's sword was very exquisite. It became sharper. He became stronger. But, Taken's eyes were only looking at Muyong's and Ifrit's fight. Muyong had disappeared for 2 years. But, Muyong had become so much stronger that the gap was insignificant. As much as Taken had become stronger? Perhaps even more. Taken was able to see that Muyong had become stronger mentally as well as physically. After seeing Muyong, he had been instantly reconnected. Also, that connection had become stronger than before. Most undead will trust you and follow you as their master again. Taken was no different. Just, he was more competitive than other undead. Wouldn't all the undead follow him like how I followed him at a glance? There wouldn't be a lot of people who would instantly trust and follow a person who had disappeared for 2 years. Taken was able to believe after seeing Muyong fight with Ifrit now, but it was hard to think that all undead would be the same. Nevertheless, Taken was not worried at all. This is enough. The current Muyong was enough to erase all concerns. First strike, second strike, 23rd strike, 24th strike. How could a strength that isn't godly do something to me? Ifrit was taken back. His arrogant appearance from the beginning had slowly disappeared. It could only be the case. As more strikes were made through Muyong's sword, it became stronger by multiple times. Also, although there wasn't any godly strength, Muyong himself was like a storage of godliness. Lucifer. Diablo's fire. Gabriel's wings and spear. They all contained godliness, and besides Lucifer's strength, Muyong was able to freely use them all. If Muyong was able to control this power a bit more maturely, he would be able to reach demigod level. A true transcendental being. What was more, Muyong's sword had everything melted within it. The ability to even produce a huge injury on Ifrit's body. At last, the 40th strike. Crack! The fire was split. One of Ifrit's arms had been cut off. The fire that was cut off didn't regenerate. It was because Muyong had sliced the grains and cut off the connection. Muyong did not allow the fire to re-enter the area itself again. Muyong's sword was inclusive of everything, but to be exact, it was a strength to control space. The ability to erase space, ability execution of space. Receive the baptism of fire. Blaze. Brawl. Small flames poured endlessly from the sky. It was smaller in scale compared to Diablo, but it fell down condensed enough that it was enough to destroy everything it touched. 41st strike. Swoosh. With just 40 strikes, Ifrit's defense was penetrated. Muyong understood his space and eroded it. So, now it was completely Muyong's turn. At the 41st strike, both of Ifrit's arms flew off. 42nd strike. He cut out all the flames that dropped in his surroundings. 43rd strike. By using 32-fold acceleration, he used numerous formless strikes. 44th strike. Anguish had cut the space itself where Muyong and Ifrit stood. Then, the great explosion disappeared. Ifrit's body had started to become thinner. I won't die. When spirits die, they just get summoned again. By returning to the spirit world, he would get some rest and recover again. And so, it was commonly known for spirits to not die. As this occurs to even ordinary spirits, the Spirit King would not die in ordinary ways. However, would that really be the case? Muyong raised Anguish. Ifrit said he doesn't die? There weren't any beings like that. Everything died. Even beings that are known as immortals also died. Even gods face the disappearance called death. Towards a place not visible, Muyong used execution of space. So, in total, 45 strikes. Muyong cut off the pathway that connected Ifrit to another world. How could a mere human cut off space? This isn't possible. Ifrit knew about Muyong's real identity. No matter how much strength he was able to use, there was always a form of the source. However, that was why it was more unbelievable. There were no events in the past where a human killed a spirit king. That wasn't all. The star of the absolute scattered redder light. Then, Ifrit's body became dust and started to be absorbed into the star. Muyong moved to reach into Ifrit's body. Then, he grabbed a fire residue that existed in the middle and poured it into his mouth. Lord Class, Death Lord. Muyong had just taken a few skills from Death Lord. It was hard to say he was truly a Death Lord. However, he had received the possibility to go beyond that and become a Death Lord himself. I refuse. However, Muyong shook his head. He was definitely covetous of Death Lord's strength. If he was to accept it now, he could become much stronger than he was right now. As all classes would disappear and he would have only one. However, in this world, there was no offer that was just sweet. The moment he becomes a Death Lord, he would need to give up his own path again. Until now, Death Lord's power just supported Muyong. But, he couldn't become it itself. It wasn't just for Death Lord's strength, but all strength was so. It could be a supporting power, but it couldn't be the main source of his power. I refuse. One by one, the names of the rest of Masters of Darkness had popped up. The number was 10. As there were 11 Masters of Darkness, it was all besides Kingslayer. Although he was curious why this sort of offer was given all of a sudden, Muyong had refused them all. Even though their offer was definitely sweet, and the rewards they gave were also amazing, it wasn't enough to give up Muyong's own uniqueness. Chapter 185, The Noble Castle, 1. Translation, Te. Edit, Sefter. Due to Muyong's continued rejection, the Masters of Darkness didn't interfere any further. The rejecter? Only one title could be used. Muyong's current title was Darkness and Abyss, all skills plus 10, but after rejecting the demands of the Masters of both sides, the title that resulted was twice as good. He grinned as he checked the next thing. Constellation map. There was nothing on the map. But some places were shining and Weung knew that they were the 12 zodiac constellations. Was he to personally collect the remaining 12 zodiac constellations? After putting the map in the infinite pouch, Weung tramped over the remaining ashes. With this, Ifrit had disappeared without a trace. Then, as he turned his head, he saw a familiar figure. And Takin. It's been a while. Takin said as he slowly approached. Takin's outer features had not changed. Since his birth as a skeleton, it was true that there was virtually no change except for decay. However, the energy he gave off was completely different. He had become several times stronger. It was impossible to make this much of a change in a day or two. Perhaps, many things had changed while Weung was at Diablo's altar. How much time has passed? 2 years. 2 years. Even so, it was a relief. It was still before much had happened. There was still time to reap the benefits from Weung's remaining knowledge. To me, it feels like it was only yesterday, but it has already been 2 years. Come to think of it, Weung hadn't gained only 1 or 2 things from Diablo's altar. Practically speaking, to have gained those things in the space of a few days was nonsense. What about the other undead? Apart from B. Sungmin, I don't know. That guy set up an information guild in the great city. You don't seem to know about the place. It's dangerous to go into the demon god's territory right now. It meant that he hadn't been able to confirm by entering. Weung had no choice but to find it odd. Tell me. Diablo killed a demon god. After that, the demon gods tightened the guard in their territory. A monster called the Sky Lord has entered the demon god's territory and is blocking the mountain range. Sky Lord. He had heard about it before. However, he hadn't encountered one personally. A monster that ate away at the sky. It was the size of a small city. However, it was not the appearance of the Sky Lord that surprised Weung. Diablo killed a demon god. It was the demon god called Ors. I don't know the exact circumstances either. Ever since Diablo's appearance, monsters like that Ifrit that you killed kept being summoned. Those things attacked humans and demons alike far and wide. After that, around this time last year, Diablo personally killed Ors. Diablo was certainly shaking things up. It had only been 2 years since he had been summoned. In that time, he had killed a demon god. Diablo was completely alone. Summoning like this would be to create an army that was his alone. But, even though the 72 demon gods were in the middle of a factional fight, to burrow into the midst of them and kill one was not an everyday event. Furthermore, if it was Ors, it was the demon god of fire. There was a high possibility that Diablo had personally gained that fire. He would be stronger, and the demon gods would be forced to be on alert. But Diablo was a destructive being. He wanted the destruction of everything. It couldn't be just a good thing. When Weung was silent for a while, Takin secretly slipped his hand over to his waist. Are we going to fight? His hands seemed itchy. Takin had become stronger, as much as Weung had. What was more, Takin intended to beat Weung. Because of that, he was in constant pursuit. Since they finally met after 2 years, he wanted to take advantage of it. Weung nodded. There was nothing else for either of them to say. An was incapable of speech. Fire Spirit King Ifrit. He hadn't been simply dispelled, but had gone extinct. The extinction of spirits was something she had never heard of nor seen before. On top of that, if that being was the Spirit King, there was even less to say. However, what was even more surprising was that the Spirit King referred to Weung as a human. Because the Fire Spirit King had said this, it would undoubtedly be true. Humans. Beings that had suddenly appeared in the underworld. They had a reputation for being the worst. Even though there were numerous species in the underworld, they ruthlessly drove out the weaker ones and erected a city. Even worse, recently that place was growing increasingly violent. The majority of the elves were especially wary of the humans. This was because there were no humans who weren't aiming for a beautiful elf. But Myung was a human? How could a human cause the extinction of a spirit that had reached the heights of purity? Even more surprising was the fight with the Death Knight. He is like a person crazy for fighting. The two were like comrades. They fought against Ifrit and the spirits together. But when the fight was over, they scarily drew their weapons against each other. Anne used her empathy skill. Myung was thirsty. Even Ifrit hadn't been able to quench his thirst. Just how greedy was he? Indeed. Taken was surprised. When he faced his sword, he was able to see how much more Myung had advanced. Even worse, even though he was Taken, it was utterly impossible for him to imitate the sword Myung used. It had no shape or method. It was the complete opposite of Taken's spider web-like swordsmanship. But the spider web could not trap Myung. Thud. A total of 39 strikes. Taken's sword flew away from him. Even though it was less than the total of 45 strikes that Ifrit had endured, it was still a big deal. Even the existing humanity's 10 strongest, excluding Dragon Lord Hansung, would find it difficult to endure 35 rounds of the Sword of the Nameless. Kohaha. Like this, another mountain for me to climb has appeared. Taken liked his defeat. This was because Taken's ability had stagnated lately. He had asked humanity's top 10 strongest for a fight and had killed monsters of the highest grade, but his abilities hadn't increased. They also weren't enough to quench Taken's thirst. In that moment, Myung appeared. Myung and his Sword of the Nameless were matchlessly profound. Just including the sword increased his discernment. Myung sheathed his sword. I'll hunt the remaining fire dragons. Dragon hunting. I'll come with you. Taken joined with excitement. It was as if he thought of the dragon as the puppy next door. At the sight of the two of them, Anne was forced to be silent. 7. To be precise, they were able to capture 2 more fire dragons. The rest seemed to have deserted their positions right after Ifrit died. In that way, 7 bone dragons were born. A fighting power that could easily eradicate a small city. It would be difficult even for a large-scale guild to face 7 bone dragons at once. It was a satisfactory achievement for Myung as well. At the same time, there was a change in the effect of complete victory. Dragon Slayer. After killing a total of 7 fire dragons, an effect like this emerged. The natural enemy modifier had also been created. In the future, dragons would feel an unidentifiable sense of fear when they saw Myung. It meant that it would be hopeless to try being close friends with them, but since he would have that much more of an advantage from the beginning when fighting dragons, it wasn't a bad thing. What are you doing next? I suggest that you gather your undead again, and go to the demon god's territory. I can't go right now. Then. There is something I have to get from the noble castle. He had already gained a lot from the Spring of Light. But Myung was greedy. He had to eat constantly in order to be satisfied. Also, if this place was close to the noble castle, there would definitely be something to be gained. Elursico. Ancient weapons. They were definitely buried in the basement of the noble castle. From the outset, it was a place that was built by the Rain clan to hide them. But even the Rain clan was unable to operate Elursico. If they were able to operate them, the Rain clan would have a huge advantage in future chaos. Your gaze has improved. Taken spoke. Myung shrugged his shoulders. So my gaze was nothing special before. Your purpose is more clearly visible now. 2 years ago I felt like I was being dragged into something invisible. Clear purpose. He had it. Myung had established a plan from inside Diablo's flames. He had caught Wang Chunglin, but everything was not over. The elimination of the demon gods. The return of the humans. I will attack humanity for that purpose. Mankind was the child of infinite possibility. However, they had not been under threat for decades. So, they had become indolent, and the military power they had gained from being at war with the demon kings in the past had stagnated at that level. Muyong was determined to be that enemy. Muyong had wanted to be the hero, but he couldn't. Instead, he would become a complete villain, so that true heroes could be born. Then, after gathering the fragments of the fissure, he will join the factional fight among the demon gods. That was all Muyong was able to do. If it was a simple military force, Muyong could someday catch up to them, but several demon gods couldn't be killed by strength simply because he was stronger. There needed to be certain conditions to be met for demon gods that achieved true immortality. And those conditions required the awakening of humanity. It was this truth that he had realized in Diablo's flames. In addition, all the demon gods had to be removed before the humans could return. Lord Muyong, will it be alright if I join you? Muyong and Takan had finished all the repairs and got ready to leave. Then, Anne came in and passed on the leathers with the moon's blessings while bowing her head. Anne was the highest high elf. An elf that received the moon's blessing. The reason she wanted to join Muyong was simple. Why? Lord Shandalton is away, and our tribe is in indescribable danger. Muyong defeated the fire dragons, but I don't know when this type of threat will come and find us again. So isn't it that you need our strength? I don't know the world. I'm surrounded by prejudice. There was nothing as scary as prejudice. If everyone had known that Muyong was a human from the start, the elves of the Golden Tribe would not have stopped their attack on him. As a result, there would have been a good chance of their collapse. Thinking about it now made her feel dizzy. Furthermore, they had lacked knowledge about the fire dragons. They had been helpless against their attack. When the Spirit King had appeared, they had been discouraged. However, a human being, Muyong, had caused him to go extinct. All she knew was what she had learned from books and stories. It was incredibly shallow. Anne, who had lived in the spring since birth, felt the absence of knowledge because of these results. She also felt the fear of prejudice. So she thought she should learn about the world. Together. Now that Shandalton was absent, they said they would serve Muyong. In fact, there had been some speculations that it would be safer with Muyong working hard for the tribe. If there is any obstruction, I will throw it away without mercy. I will make an effort to be helpful. Anne hardened her expression. The fate of her tribe rested on this choice. She couldn't help being serious. Pei. At that moment, Snow ran over from afar. Just in case the situation called for it, he had entrusted her to the elves. Muyong had completely forgotten about Snow due to his meeting with Takan. I almost left her. Chapter 186, The Noble Castle, 2. Translation, Nadu. Edit, Sefter. The Noble Castle. The only castle that could compare to the great city. Just, if there was something different between the two, it would be that the great city was built by humans. However, the scale was beyond one's imagination. The noble castle was divided into a total of 5 districts: Blue Dragon, Red Bird, White Tiger, Black Tortoise, and the external island that was located at the outskirts. There was only one way to prove themselves in this place. Strength. In reality, the zone of Noble Castle existed for strong people. A structure where only the strong ones could climb up the ladder. Of course, vested interests also existed at this place. The 4 huge clans, including the Rain clan that controlled the Noble Castle, could be more liberal than others in the logic of power. Nevertheless, the creed that justice was power didn't greatly change. The weak died out for them. Only the strong were able to enjoy all the authority. Those who rose to power were drunk with authority and changed. But, power changes people. Rather, when a person earns power, they show their true self. Muyong was definitely fond of this zone of strong people in the noble castle, but after people got strong, they didn't strive to become stronger. This was also because people were stained with peace. You were able to know by just seeing how the strength of the top 10 humans didn't change from when they fought the demon kings in the past. Only the Dragon Lord Hansung was categorized as the number 1. Either way, Muyeong was planning to earn a lot of the ancient weapons, Elersigo, while he stayed at Noble Castle. Thus, he decided to be enemies with everything. Muyeong was the enemy of demon gods, Diablo, and humanity. He had decided to be that person. He was centered on that. It's just as I remember. The external island was the only place where you could enter without permission within Noble Castle. The external island was like the name itself suggested, it referred to the location on the very outskirts of the city. But, Muyeong was greeted with a terrible stench. In the outermost area, there was a scene like a slum that was surrounded by small wire mesh like barbed wire fences. The external island was the land of the weak. A place that was abandoned. This place was filled with remnants of defeated troops. Those who had even made names for themselves in the past were tossed aside to the external island once they lost their strength due to injury. They had to devise a way to somehow live in this barren place where nothing was really given to them. Due to this distinction, they didn't try to move up to the zone of the strong, but also because they had one last hope. Advancement test. Once every 3 months. They took a test to climb up the ladder. Everyone in the external island was counting on this test. Thinking they were different than others. Everyone had that thought. Despite the fact that there were only a few who could climb up. Muyeong had experience infiltrating into this external island for a year. That was why he knew about the ecology of this place better than anyone else. However, he had no plans to go up the ladder slowly. To Muyeong, time was more precious than gold. He needed a much faster, much more preposterous method. Muyeong got on a fire bone dragon. The 7 bone dragons were floating in the sky. On top, Taken, Snow, and An were each on a dragon. What is that? Bone dragon? 7 bone dragons. The people in external island were in awe. Ring. Ring. Even the ones within the actual castle quickly acted. However, Muyeong didn't show any intention to attack. Instead, he used a different name. Let it be known that the legitimate child of the Command clan, Banya, has returned. Muyeong became Banya. The Command clan was one of the 5 great clans. Although they had currently lost a lot of power, they still kept their place as one of the 5 great clans with their tradition and their bizarreness. However, because of the characteristics of clans, they needed someone to carry on the family line, and the only legitimate child, Banya, was currently missing due to an accident that happened in his childhood. Large amounts of manpower and money were used to find Banya, but after 17 years, they were still unable to find Banya. The power was more tilted towards one side, and the 5 great clans even debated whether they would take the Command clan out. In reality, if they were to continue this situation, another clan would take their place in the 5 great clans. They were in that dire of a situation. Muyeong appeared then. No, Banya appeared. With 7 bone dragons. It was truly a glorious return. Even if they know I'm a fake, they wouldn't be able to cast me out. Many people knocked on Command clan's door saying they were Banya. Their heads were all cut off and were placed on a pole. Legitimacy. Was it due to the fact that the clans placed importance on bloodline? Muyeong shook his head. It was 17 years. Banya was too young and it had been too long since then to remember his characteristics. They just didn't have anyone to substitute Banya. It was indisputable information Muyeong had earned when he assassinated the head of the Command clan in the past, Bango. That was right, they would never be able to take him out. Rather they would try to use this opportunity however they could. They could reveal Muyeong was a fake and kill him later on. Murmur. Murmur. Numerous people gathered at the castle wall. As no one had seen 7 bone dragons fly together. They were half wary, and half surprised about Muyeong. On top, everyone knew that Muyeong had no intention to fight. Banya. Isn't he another fake? Do fakes ride a bone dragon, normally? They were suppressed by the dignity of the bone dragons. They weren't even ordinary bone dragons. Muyong was standing on top of a bone dragon that was on fire. Banya? Are you really Banya? Then, an old man wearing yellow clothing and a few masters appeared on top of the castle wall as they rode on a carriage pulled by 12 horses. The great elder of the command clan, Banha. His appearance meant that the command clan was seriously considering accepting Muyong. Muyong forced a smile. Banha. It's been a long time. Are you still mad about Yugong's death? Yugong was a dog Banha had raised. Banya had killed it. However, there were only a very few who knew of this truth. It wasn't something that was announced publicly. Banha's eyes greatly widened. It seemed like they hadn't thought that Banya had really come back. Indeed, there had to be differences from Banya in his memories and Muyong's appearance. Besides big characteristics, Muyong did not use other disguises. They would have thought the person was fake again, but if he knew about Yugong, it was a different story. I have returned. After gaining a much stronger power for the command clan. Quickly open the door, Banha. Muyong pressured Banha. 7 bone dragons. Many were watching its status. What was more, if this strength was all Banya's? The clan would have another chance to thrive. Banha seemed to be slightly hesitant. It was because there were many scammers who knocked on their door. However, he knew of Yugong and had that much strength. If someone had that much strength, there would have been rumors, but Banha had never heard of him. For him to control 7 burning bone dragons. Bone dragons were top rank. By himself, he could destroy a small city. Open the door. Banha made a decision. Although Banha didn't know whether he was real or fake, he decided to accept him. A slight smile appeared on Muyong's face. Information was Muyong's greatest weapon. Creating profit using information others didn't know. It was also the same right now. Muyong had used the information only he knew, the secret of the command clan, in order to gain their trust. And so, he had instantly skipped all the steps and was able to enter the innermost area, the Blue Dragon's district. Either way, Muyong was going to use this Banya's name to gain the ancient weapons, Elersigo, and get rid of it, but until he finds the Elersigo, he was going to pretend to be Banya whether he liked it or not. If there was anything that was fortunate, it was that Banya's personality itself was audacious. Banya was similar to Muyong in that he didn't read others. The command clan was large. There were 30,000 masters belonging to the clan. Although it was a small number compared to other huge clans, you could say they were all elites. And now their master, Command Bango, was in front of his eyes. It was strange for someone who he assassinated in the past to now be in the role of his father. Ah, Banya! Were you truly alive? Inside a grand venue. Bango, who was sitting on his own throne, went down the stairs and tightly hugged Muyong. However, he didn't just hug him. He was trying to send out an energy seedling in order to search Muyong's insides. Muyong inwardly grinned. Bango! If he knew Muyong's real identity, he wouldn't do something like this. There was no one who could control energy as well as Muyong. Although Muyong couldn't show him everything, he couldn't show just any strength either. Muyong only allowed Bango feel the strength of death. Hey! Bango was very surprised after getting a taste of Muyong's abyss-like strength. His whole body shuddered and let out an exclamation. It seems like a lot has happened in the last 17 years. I'm glad you're back. After seeing Muyong's strength, Bango considered Banya as his son. But, Bango didn't just let his guard down entirely. If he was fake, he would definitely want to find out the reason for it. So, Muyong first tried to gain his trust. As he needed a place to hide until he finds the Elersigo. I now want to work for the clan. Of course, you need to. That way we can call you the legitimate son of the command clan. Bango smiled happily. But, they are. Bango pointed towards those who were behind Muyong. Takan, An, and Snow. The three that had their own unique characteristics had also gained the gaze of others, besides Bango. Pa! Snow watched the others, and when Weong looked at her, she ran towards him without any hesitation and hugged him. Then Bango's expression slightly hardened. Is this your daughter? She seems a bit big to be your daughter. Weong shook his head. She isn't my daughter. She is not herself. Are you saying she is a mentally challenged child? Why did you bring this child with you? Weong made up a reasonable story. Either way, if the three just kept their mouths shut, they would never know the truth. These three are my colleagues who helped me survive the last 17 years. Additionally, they are stronger than anyone here beside the head of the family. Enough. Your words are too harsh for someone young. A man who just listened to their conversation popped out. Ban Zhong. The one who led the largest military group, the command team. It seemed like he didn't like Weong. Well, Weong was someone who suddenly appeared. He was the one who had the second greatest influence after the head of the family. However, there was a great chance that his status would be greatly shaken through Weong's appearance. Weong looked at him and spoke. Would you like to fight? Thud. Taken took a step out. Taken wore a black armor that covered his entire body. He pulled out his sword without any hesitation. Restrained movement. It was an appearance of a master to anyone. What are you doing in this holy venue? However, Taken spoke without any hesitation. I will kill whoever insults my lord. A completely vicious tone. In reality, it felt like chills. Weong inwardly nodded his head. Although he wasn't sure what had happened in 2 years. Taken's acting skills had drastically increased. Chapter 187, The Noble Castle. Translation, Te. Edit, Sefter. Banjung's face turned red. He was an old man. As he was older, he was that much stronger and had plentiful battle experience. Looking at it like that, this situation itself was like a child's game. However, the game was a bit violent. Banjung spoke rigidly with a firm expression. My lord, the return of young Master Banya is a matter to be congratulated, but the order of the clan must be kept. As the young master has lived a foreign life for a long time, it seems he has forgotten the clan's order. Order? Weong inwardly clicked his tongue. The command clan was the oldest and one of the largest clans. There was a certain order, but Weong had no interest in that sort of thing. In spite of order, in the end, strength was justice. Weong had already proved his strength by showing 7 bone dragons. Nevertheless, to still oppose him seemed like a frantic last-ditch effort to Weong. Banjung. He became the next head. That was true in Weong's memory. The clan leader, Bango, had been assassinated by Weong, and Banjung had risen into his position. After that, the rapid collapse had begun. This was because he was only good at fighting, and was ignorant in politics and economics. During a time at the height of the confusion. If Weong could sum it up, it was a time of foul politics. There were innumerable groups that fell prey to all sorts of plots and absurd gossip, and disappeared. The command clan couldn't adjust to that flow. To be precise, Banjung was incredibly passive. His greatest challenge was his inability to accept changes easily. In any case, in the situation where the next leader was almost decided, Weong, no, Banya appeared. It was enough to make his lower stomach hurt. He'd try to suppress Weong and keep his position somehow. In fact, it looked like there was hardly anyone in the clan on Weong's side. There were merely those who wanted to try to use Weong and those who hated him. Weong also was well aware of that. So, he intended to use them instead, and make this place a hideout. You cannot fight in the venue. Also, should you not listen to Banya's opinion? Bango came up with a compromise. However, this was only for appearances, and it was probably meant to test Weong and his military power. After all, not all of them were satisfied by the 7 bone dragons. People were selfish and wanted power they could control. Since Muyong had displayed his strength here, they would certainly try to keep him in check. So Muyong decided to leave the matter entirely to Takan and An. Perhaps roughly understanding him, Takan nodded to Muyong. "You've changed a lot." Muyong could sense that he knew how to act, and that he knew how to read the situation. He was a little curious about how Takan had been living for the past 2 years. "Anytime." Muyong spoke leisurely. He secretly looked around and stuck out his chest as arrogantly as possible. Although Muyong enjoyed hiding in the shadows and assassinations, he had never disguised himself like this and impersonated someone. Perhaps if Banya was still alive, he would give off this kind of feeling. Muyong then looked around and added a few more words. "I am the heir of the Command clan. If you don't like it, force yourselves to submit." You. Incredibly arrogant words. The chairman's aura hardened in an instant. However, this was all possible because he was the Command clan's heir. Muyong had stressed that point. Rather, he would have been disappointed if he didn't. As expected, Bango smiled subtly. "This is the best as a hideout." Muyong only had to gain the appropriate amount of trust. In any case, his real goal was not the Command clan. The ancient weapons, Elersigo. Muyong's only purpose here were the things that were sealed in the ground. Takan went up on the platform. This platform that was neither wide nor narrow was the arena. The person that came up as Takan's opponent was a middle-aged man. Banzan. Banjung's apprentice. He was perhaps the strongest of those that followed Banjung. Muyong watched him carefully as well. He didn't care whether it was Banjung or Banzan. It was just that he wanted to keep an eye on Takan's progress. Even though it was only in the arena, Muyong felt that Takan was hovering around the level of humanity's 10 strongest. But that was only a numerical concept, and real ability was revealed in a life-or-death battle. Banjung and Banzan were going to try to kill Takan. So even before the start of the fight, Muyong could see their plan to take him down a peg. On the other hand, for Muyong, it was a question of whether to kill or spare his opponent. If his opponent was killed, his future actions would change depending on what he did after, and if he spared his opponent, it would be a warning to some extent and, at the same time, his behavior in the Command clan would be a little free. Although, either way, there were prerequisites for winning. "I am Banzan." Takan. Takan was maintaining his concept. An ignorant warrior. However, the type of warrior that knew only honor. Takan, who was wearing black full-body armor, pulled out a sword. Swung. A gigantic greatsword. Banzan's weapon was a knife. A 1.5-meter-long ornamental knife. One side of its blade was shining. And people who showed promise participated as the duel's observers. The clan head Bango was also included among them. "Start the duel." At Bango's words, Banzan rapidly began to move. Banzan was the most boasted master in the Command clan. The apprentice of Banjung, who led the Command family. However, his talent was so superior, it could be written as the most promising. He stepped on the floor with the 8th step. It was a move that dazzled the eyes of his opponent. The feeling was inexplicably slow, but approaching and cutting the opponent in two seemed to be Banzan's tactic. At that moment, fog surrounded Banzan. The fog blurred the view and made identification of Banzan's location confusing. An obfuscation skill. Thud. Takan stepped heavily on the ground. Wheeing. Then, a strong wind blew away the fog. On the other hand, calm winds swirled around Takan. Takan could feel everything in contact with the wind blast. Like a spider that knew what was on its web. Banzan walked the path of the dense wind without any suspicion. He was sure that his skills would work even though the fog had blown away. Takan lifted his sword up. Of course, his chest was open. He was preparing in order to unleash some sort of technique. However, the preparatory gesture was too big. Banzan penetrated that gap. Suyuk. The shortest distance. A fast/crossways. Poof. However, Banzan only hit the air. He had only cut Taken's after image. Kayag. On the other hand, Banzan vomited blood. Before he knew it, he had a long wound that stretched from his shoulder to his belly button. Body Bow Shadow Bomb. Rather than the Body Bow Shadow Bomb, isn't that the Royal Spirit Charge? Well, it's a bizarre skill. Body Bow Shadow Bomb was a technique where the body bent and moved instantly, while the Royal Spirit Charge was a skill where the energy was subdued then sprung upwards. Taken seemed to have used a mixture of the two. And there was one more thing. The usage of the techniques while cutting down the approaching opponent. While striking with his sword, through that half-flexibility he had quickly fallen, however, at the same time, he had somehow cut down Banzan. If he did this intentionally, he would be a ridiculous master. There is nothing else to see. Everything was shown in one strike. A clear distinction in ability. Seeing the technique that Taken had just used, he was forced to nod his head. Myung was the same. Where had Taken earned that ability to use offensive and defensive battle methods at the same time? Still, Banzan got back up. He was bleeding a lot, but not enough to die. Taken stretched his neck. He didn't seem to like it because Banzan hadn't fallen meekly. Then, Taken switched his great sword to a reverse grip. Hudush! Along with the sound of wind, he quickly moved like a sword being drawn. Before he realized it, Taken was standing behind Banzan. Banzan's body was in exactly two pieces. Without losing even a drop of blood, Taken sheathed his sword and came down from the field. Everyone was speechless. Even when Banzan had died and become a corpse, Banjung and Bango were unable to regain their senses. The highest level of martial arts. Mastery skill that surpassed a certain point. Banjung and Bango were both unable to read Taken's movements. If either of them had been in Banzan's position, would they have been able to block him? He still has a hot-tempered personality. He was originally going to spare his life. However, Myung knew that when Banzan had risen again, Taken had killed him impulsively. Still, Taken's growth could be seen. In terms of handling the sword, he had exceeded Sword 1. Taken, who had been horribly defeated by Sword 1 a little over 2 years ago, had overcome that defeat and now appeared stronger. Myung also had no choice but to nod his head. As the heir to the Command clan, I am ready to accept a duel at any time. But he wanted stability, but he shouldn't give the impression that it was too easy. Myung had to be made to seem as if it would be wasteful if he was disposed of, but he was not exactly desired either one. Myung left the field with Taken while speaking coolly. I'll have to take your life. Banya, the heir of the Command clan, had returned. The rumor spread quickly. The noble castle was wide but narrow. Especially those called the vested interests class knew everything that happened inside the noble castle. Of course, they had to pay attention to the hot topic, which was Banya's return. 7 Bone Dragons. The power to wipe out a medium clan by himself. Banya was the subject of the week. Bone dragons were top-level monsters. The difference was obvious depending on the materials used to make them, but if it was a fire bone dragon, it would be enough for the top 3 levels. 7 of those monsters. The Command clan is going to rise again. Even though Banya himself was not proven. The Command clan will show up at the banquet after 10 years. The Lawless clan has fallen. There are many clans that aimed after the Command clan's position. I'm looking forward to this banquet in many ways. The 5 great clans should always be maintained. However, the Lawless clan that had established a foothold in the great city had fallen. Everyone was hushed up regarding the fall of the Lawless clan, however, seeing their behavior, it was only natural that one day they had fallen. and the middle clans were all fiercely competing for that position. The command clan, who had also gradually fallen, was on the road to recovery. They couldn't stand still. They would certainly make a move. Are you guys just going to watch? And the heirs to great clans like Banya were all gathered in one place. A secret room. In fact, it was a place where all the heirs of the great clans, excluding the command and lawless clans, interacted with each other. They were not happy about Banya's sudden appearance. The command clan dealt with corpses. There were many who didn't view that bizarreness happily. While it was decaying naturally, Banya had emerged. Of course, Banya was an eyesore to them. Everyone's gaze fell on one person. One man was leaning against a wall. He seemed to be in his mid to late 30s, and there was a subtle but indescribably heavy mood around him. The man who was responsible for this gathering, and who had the greatest power. His words certainly had a ripple effect. At the very least, there was no one at the noble castle who defied him. The noble castle. An enormous fortress and birthplace. The one that was treated like the king of the place was one man. The Rain clan's heir, Rain Gun. Up until now, he had kept silent, but now he spoke. He has to be suppressed, so that he can't crawl up. Translator's notes. Original phrase was chicken ribs, Jiruk, an idiomatic expression of Chinese origin describing a war situation in which both sides were evenly matched, so even victory would be Pyrrhic. Chapter 188. The Banquet, 1. Translation, Nadu. Edit, Sefter. The night was Muyong's time. When the sun set and the moon rose, Muyong began to act. He melted into the darkness and looked over everything. The noble castle. Among them, even the ones that were in the highest rank of the Blue Dragon district wouldn't be able to catch Muyong at this hour. Especially, as he was acting in the inner walls, Muyong was a will-o'-the-wisp itself. In the end, humanity wasn't able to operate the Elursigo. There was only one reason why Muyong acted. It was to steal the Elursigo. The Rain clan had hidden the sealed storage room of Elursigo, but in the end, they weren't able to operate. Rather, it was the demon gods who were able to operate the Elursigo that were near 100 in number. Thanks to this, there was a bloodbath in Noble Castle. There were more than 1 million deaths. This was the event that rapidly led humanity to its fall. Elursigo was a weapon created by an ancient dragon. But, Muyong knew. At this moment in time, only Muyong knew how to operate the Elursigo. A long time ago, the Elursigo were weapons created by dragons to kill gods. A very old story where a transcendental being that was called the King of all Dragons didn't exist. Of course, seeing how they were sealed and tucked away, it seemed like they failed to kill a god, but the Elursigo were so strong that you could say their efforts weren't wasted. So, in order to break the seal of the storage room that locked away the Elursigo, he needed two things. An extremely pure divine strength. A dragon's power. Muyong had both. It meant that besides snow, only Muyong could open the storage room. Where would they hide it? The problem was, Muyong also didn't know the location. However, it was only a matter of time. While there was night, he would continue his search. Furthermore, Muyong was so familiar with the inner parts of the noble castle that he could walk around it with his eyes closed. There were over 10 assassinations that had happened at this place. The Elursigo are a secret only known to the top few members of the Rain clan. They would have hidden the storage room with multiple layers of mechanisms. Of course, it wouldn't be at a location where it was visible to the eye. It wouldn't be in the inside of the Rain clan either. Muyong drew a map of Noble Castle in his head. Then, after checking a few places among them, he quickly started to act. Pierce. Unable to even scream. When a small needle entered the neck, the man who was on the watch fell. Beside him, Muyong suddenly appeared. The assassination skills had melded with his body. They wouldn't be rusty just because he didn't use them. Not here either. There were a lot of secrets within the noble castle. Of course, there was a lot hidden. This was already the 7th place he'd checked. When he went down a narrow underground cave, he found all kinds of talismans piled up. It was a type of a slush fund, since talismans were common currency used in the underworld. The number was over 10,000. They were even all B rank or above talismans. It was truly a result made by sweat and blood. You could probably buy a castle with this many talismans of this quantity and quality. I thought there was an unusual amount of watchers, they were hiding something like this. Myung pulled out one among them. Name, Natural Fondness. Rank, A. Type, Disposable. Effect, although your appearance might be crappy or you did something bad, it will make the person turn back once more even if they are mad. Asterisk effect lasts for 120 hours. Asterisk stronger favorability correction. Asterisk optical illusion effect that thins line. Although the rank was high, the content was quite lacking. Although there could be a use for them, most of the talismans here were like that. It seemed like they placed the good ones somewhere else to use them. But, if it was this quality, Myung could still use them. Myung opened his infinite pouch and collected them all. Either way, although their content might be lacking, it was worth taking as a currency. It was a waste to leave behind enough currency to buy himself a castle. Myung was a person who prepared, and there would be a time where it will be of use. After placing all the talismans into the infinite pouch, he spread his hand. Blaze! A holy flame burned the inner parts of the cave. Slush fund. A secret place that was hidden. As it wasn't something they were proud of, it wouldn't be publicized. To the contrary, there was a high chance that the owner of this place would try their best to hide this event. Myung turned his back. And suddenly disappeared. Did you hear? That a great thief secretly entered Noble Castle. The streets were filled with conversations. Due to the events that occurred over a few days, a person was being talked about. The story of the sudden appearance of Banya, the legitimate child of the Command clan, was a big issue, but this was as big as that news. Isn't he just a thief? He'll probably get caught in a few days and be hanging in the entrance with his hands and feet cut off. No. This great thief is different. There were a lot of famous thieves, but they didn't steal from the Blue Dragon district. There were a lot of people who have been known as a great thief or a righteous outlaw. As it was a world of survival of the fittest, there were many people who specialized in evil. Among them, the ones who were well known reached master level. However, even those thieves avoided the Noble Castle. Even if they did rob places, they didn't dare to look at the Blue Dragon district. Thieves who did such a bold thing all died. Their hands and feet were cut off and were fed to the dogs. However, this great thief was still alive. It's just a rumor. As his identity isn't confirmed, wouldn't it just be something like a city legend? It looks like he is after the slush funds accumulated by the high-ranking officials, the influential people. They say he has already cleaned out a few dozen places. Nah, those people aren't the type to just sit there and be robbed. Stop spouting nonsense. Like this, there were a lot of people who thought of the news as just a rumor. The Noble Castle was a gathering place for masters. Especially the Blue Dragon district, it was filled with people who were experts. However, they couldn't catch him after he robbed a dozen places. If that was the case, the thief would have reached God level. Perhaps, he might not even be human. Crunch! A man walked in the streets while he took a bite out of an apple. With a normal impression, the man didn't really stand out. However, he made others feel a strange fondness when they looked at him. Isn't that Banya, the legitimate child of the Command clan? His impression seems a bit round to be him. Why would Banya roam around a place like this? Although he could hear them talk, the man didn't care. It's the effects of the talisman. The man was Myung. He was currently using the Natural Fondness talisman. Thanks to this, there weren't a lot of people who recognized him. Since he gave such a strong impression on his first appearance, no one thought that he would wander around the streets while eating an apple. But, a great thief! Muyong couldn't help but grin. Within the past few days, Muyong had become a great thief. A big thief. A bold thief. Either way, he was treated as a thief. Even if they were slush funds, if you rob a few dozen places it couldn't help but be rumored. Although he did it to find clues related to the Elersigo, he couldn't help but find places with slush funds when he looked around secret places. Certainly, the noble castle was as rotten as it could be. When he looked around a place that seemed suspicious, he was able to find places where people secretly hid their desires. The fact that there were so many hidden secrets meant that there were signs of disorder. When something occurred, the results of disintegration and dividing would be clearly drawn. Over 120 places left. There were still a lot of candidates left. However, there was a high chance that the Elersigo was among these hidden places. As he was certain it was somewhere within the noble castle, a month would be more than enough. No matter how much they raised their security, they couldn't avoid Muyong's hands. Muyong slowly entered a shabby building. "Would you like to order?" A child walked towards him with a menu. An ordinary restaurant. A few people sat at a table and ate food. A glass of cold beer and a glass of warm milk. Muyong spoke slowly. "Okay, I will bring them soon." The child ran towards the kitchen. After about 2 minutes, the child appeared with a glass of beer and a glass of milk and gave them to Muyong. Muyong then placed the glass of milk across from him. As if there was going to be someone else showing up. And a moment later, a giant sat in front of Muyong. "I'm Gahul of the Beast Clan." Gulp. Muyong drank his beer. Gahul. It was a name he had heard of. The legitimate child of the Beast Clan. 32nd strongest man. There weren't just slush funds in places where Muyong had robbed. From various bits of strange information to the rank log of the noble castle. Although Muyong was uncertain if he was rank 32, he seemed quite strong. The instant Gahul appeared, there was a shroud of energy in the surroundings. He was acting cautiously to not let any stories leak. "Why did you look for me?" "Be careful of the banquet." The banquet. An event where the key members of the huge clans met each other once a year. Muyong also had memories of participating in the event secretly. He shrugged his shoulders. "It's nothing. Rain Gun is a dangerous man. He moves half of the Rain clan. He doesn't like variables." Muyong was the epitome of variable. When Muyong acted, the past and the future changed. It was no exaggeration to state that there was no variable like Muyong. "Is there a reason why you are telling me this information?" "Let's say it's because it is worth watching." It was something that was accompanied by danger. He wouldn't have done this because it was worth watching. He is hostile towards Rain Gun. Or the Rain clan. Additionally, there was a high chance that it wasn't just Gahul. Other clans who were hostile towards the Rain clan. There were so many clans like that Muyong couldn't remember them all, but from what he remembered, the biggest clan was the Nameless Society. Because it was a strict cell, it was impossible to get rid of them, but it was the biggest organization created to fight against the Rain clan who wielded absolute power. What a joke! So, Muyong dismissed it. After drinking the beer in one gulp, Muyong got out of his seat. When Muyong tried to leave, Gahul grabbed Muyong's shoulder. A joke. Gahul couldn't stand still after Muyong thought of his actions, or how the Rain clan was hostile towards him, as nonsense. However, to Muyong, it was no more and no less than a joke. If it was a normal person, Gahul's grip would crush the person's shoulder, but Muyong was fine. On the contrary, Muyao held Gahul's hand. Gake. Gahul suppressed his scream. Even when the bones of his hand broke and were twisted in a strange way, Muyong didn't let go of his hand. For him to have this much power. Gahul changed his prejudiced thoughts about Banya. Banya didn't simply have skill regarding command just because he had 7 bone dragons. If he had this much fighting power himself, he couldn't be ignored. In that state, Muyong spoke as he glanced down. Whoever it is, the one who touches me will die. It was a good mix of Muyong and Banya's personality. Then, after throwing Gahul to the ground, Muyong got up and left. As Gahul forcefully tried to realign his bones and to overcome the pain, he filled his mouth with the liquid that was in the glass. Milk. He thought it would be a type of liquor, but it wasn't even beer. A glass of milk. It was even hot. Muyong's words suddenly came back to him, a joke. In his perspective, everything might have seemed like a child's play. Gahul frowned as he gulped the milk down in one shot. Wherever he went, there would always be power struggles, and different types of people would gather around the one who stands out. However, Muyong had no plans to be drawn into their play. Their fight and Muyong's fight were completely different. But, if someone were to meddle with him, he wasn't going to let it be ignored. He was going to make sure they knew who they drew a sword towards. Banya, do you have no plans to participate in the banquet? Bango, the headmaster of the command clan, asked. Although he asked, it felt half-forced. And Muyong didn't really have thoughts to decline either. Everyone gathered at the banquet. There was much information that was exchanged. Among them, he would be able to find some who would be related to the Elersigo. Without a doubt, it was also the perfect opportunity to place a mole in the Rain clan. Although there was a condition that the person needed to be half-killed, Muyong had the skills to even make someone who was alive into an undead. Chapter 189, The Banquet, 2. Translation, Nadu. Edit, Sefter. However, not everyone seemed to welcome the idea of Banya attending the banquet. Isn't it too soon? Banzhong. The man who sent Banzan, his disciple, to fight against Takan. He, who was one of the highest authorities of the command clan, was opposing him. The fact that Banya would participate in the banquet was a sign that they had accepted Muyong as Banya. Therefore, it couldn't be helped that Banzhong would feel reluctant. If Banya became the official successor, Banzhong's status would be jeopardized. He would have to return the privileges he had gained when there was no successor. Banzhong, why do you think it is too soon? As Bango, the head of the clan, asked, Banzhong made a slight smile. Doesn't he need to visit the godmother? When Banya was young, she was the one who cherished him dearly. I think that is the correct procedure. At that moment, Bango's expression became fiercely puckered. That Bango wasn't happy with Banzhong's comment was strongly shown. Godmother isn't mentally well. Isn't it because she lost Banya and Monang? She will be greatly pleased when she knows Banya has returned. The reason why they didn't have a successor until now was simple. It was because when Bango's wife Monang and Banya went missing, he didn't remarry. Also, there was a problem with his private part. The command clan controlled death. There were a lot of times they got addicted to poison by touching corpses. And through that poison, his private part lost its function. Bango was unable to produce any more offspring. Most people in the clan knew that this was the biggest reason why he didn't remarry. So, it was true that the focus was shifted to Banzhong. But, after Banya returned, the focus was shifted again to Bango. If the godmother was to see Banya, the results would be unpredictable. Even if he was really Banya, she wouldn't be able to recognize him. There was one thing Bango and Banzhong were certain of. Everything was shut out by the godmother as she became mentally ill. And so, she spent her days deep within the royal palace as if she was exiled. Additionally, if things went wrong, Banya could also die. She was a true master who had even faced battles against demon kings. She was a true heroine who raised the command clan, and achieved everything on her own. Even if she hadn't used her strength for a long time, she still had the appearance of a master. Although no one said anything, the atmosphere seemed to be agreeable. It seemed like people thought the godmother would recognize him if he really was Banya. Bango had no choice but to decide. He has 7 bone dragons and 3 strong allies. Banya's skills should also be above average. It was about appointing a successor. He needed everyone's consent. If he was to refuse, he could receive a counter blow. However, what if he was to lose Banya? From what Bango could tell, Banjung was full of greed. Although Banjung suppressed it well until now, if Banya died, he would fully express his lust for power. Real or fake, it was the reason why he needed the current Banya to be his successor. I will go see the godmother. Then, Myung, who acted as Banya, spoke. There was only one person known to be the godmother of the Command clan. The Dark Commander Seo Yunzi. Although she was well known in his past, she was someone whom Myung didn't meet in person. She was a mysterious master who was known to have greater skills than Wang Chunglin. Although she was already dead when Myung was active, the footsteps she left behind were enough for others to admire. To be frank, she was a retired former master. She was secretive enough that she was known as the Dark Commander, and was also known as the textbook of death as she faced thousands of devils on her own. He never expected for her to still be alive. He thought she had already passed away. If she was alive, he would like to meet her once. It was like aspiration towards someone who achieved a master level in a similar field. See? Doesn't Banya also agree? How beautiful is this sight? The godmother will also be very happy. Banjung made a move first. Bango's expression hardened even more. There was no reason to stop if the person in the matter was okay with it. As there was no way to win the case that the eldest person must first be greeted, Bango had lost this fight. A palace that seemed nothing short of a royal palace was visible. At least, in terms of the size of the palace, it seemed to be similar to the Rain clans. It was an example of how much prosperity the Command clan possessed when the palace was built. However, now it was almost empty and was like a dead palace. Bango walked with Myung. Only those who were selected could enter the palace. The godmother is stronger than anyone else here. But, as she is mentally unstable, she will be on high alert if more than one person enters. So, you must enter alone, but, if something goes wrong, you might die. Bango spoke. It was a result that was already decided, and as they could not reverse it, this was like advice. You mean, me? Myung shrugged his shoulders. Certainly, the Dark Commander Seo Yunzi was strong. If she still had the skills of her prime days, the list of the top 10 would also change. There were a few former masters who were like that, and Seo Yunzi was among them. However, even if those former masters were to barge in, they couldn't win against the current Myung. He didn't even need to let out his military power. Myung's confidence of this sort worried Bango. Bango was already half certain that Banya was really his son. If I could, I would go, but this place, the royal palace, could only be entered by those who had permission. However, there were people watching him in the surrounding. Although it was a secret location, there were still people openly observing him. They would most likely be Banjung's men. It was obvious that if Bango showed any signs of helping Banya, Banjung would push them into a corner by criticizing them about tradition and rules. I will enter alone. However, Myung was comfortable going in alone. A meeting with a former master he wanted to see. The great figure who was known to be comparable or stronger than the owner of the Forest of Death. Myung went into the much deeper parts of the palace alone. It was no different than a maze. The surroundings were dark, and spider webs were everywhere. It was evident that it wasn't maintained. It was left alone for that long. Myung walked forward as he passed the broken debris that was everywhere. Finally, he reached the deepest room. Who is it? The owner of a head of long white hair leaned against a wall. The body was full of wrinkles, and the eyes had lost focus. By looking at her appearance, she seemed to have lost her mind. The Dark Commander Seo Yunzi. For the woman who used to be portrayed as a tremendous master to be in a state like this. Banya. Myung spoke briefly. Then, Seo Yunsi raised her head and looked at Myung. No. You are not Banya. Seo Yunsi lifted her long fingernails. When she got up, she instantly reduced the distance between her and Myung and attacked him. It happened in 1/3 of a breath. Swish! Myung was holding Anguish in that short moment. Anguish cut off Seo Yunsi's fingernails. Thud! Then, he kicked Yunsi who ran towards him. Myung spoke as he looked at Yunsi who was pushed to the wall. Yes, I'm not Banya. He didn't think he needed to wear a mask. And so, Myung removed it. Then, Yunsi's body became indistinct. Like a shadow, she started to assimilate into the darkness. I will kill you. I will chew on your flesh and break your bone into pieces. Although he wasn't able to see her, the whole room rang with her voice. But, Myung threw Anguish at one corner of the room. Stab! With a sound, Anguish was dyed red. Kai-a-a-a-a-a. As she made an animalistic sound, she once again disappeared. He was unable to see her as if she had turned into an invisible person. Myung stretched out his hand. Grasp! Gaoou! Yunsi's neck was grabbed. Even if she hid her appearance, she couldn't deceive Myung's senses. It was like teaching a bird how to fly. She was comparable to Wang Chunglin, but Myung had already greatly surpassed him. In other words, it was like holding a candle to the sun. Dark Commander. Myung looked at Yunsi's face as he grabbed her neck. A distance where their breaths could reach each other. And Myung released all his strength. Ah! Okay. Yunsi started to struggle. It was because when she looked at Myung's eyes, she felt the same darkness as the abyss. As if she was struck by lightning, she was scared out of her wits. The darkness and holiness, flames of purification, and Lucifer's soul. Yunsi couldn't help but struggle in front of that chaos. However, Myung felt a strangeness as he felt and saw Yunsi's soul. Her soul was too unstable. He had also received this sort of feeling once before. You have met Dantalion. The demon god of the 71st seat, Dantalion. He took away everything in exchange for a sweet truth or a lie. When Myung met Murder Dun, he also was killed by Dantalion. Although they said Yunsi had lost her mind after losing Banya, Myung didn't think that was the case. Then, what did the Dark Commander find out before she lost her mind? Tell me what you know. Myung dug through Yunsi's soul. There wasn't much known about the demon gods. If he could find out, he needed to know. He was very curious about the truth the one who was called the Dark Commander had heard. He forcefully opened the door that was locked. Yunsi's eyes rolled up and as she showed only the whites of her eyes, she started to talk. The earth has already been destroyed. There is no place for us to return. Myung frowned. What was this all about? Even now, the gate opened once every month. The people on earth came through the gate into the underworld. It was proof that the earth was fine. If it was already destroyed, people wouldn't be able to come to the underworld. There was no way for that truth to not have spread. And if the earth did fall, Alexandro Quintart wouldn't have wanted to go back to that extent. Earth didn't fall. Elersigo is a weapon to destroy Earth. Elersigo will once again lead humanity to fall. Thud. Yunsi's head fell. Although she was breathing, it seemed like she lost consciousness. No, it seemed like she forced herself to lose consciousness on purpose. Self-defense mechanism. It was the reason why she was alive until now. Also, it was certainly the reason why she was dying. Wang Chunglin excelled at brainwashing, but Yunsi seemed to excel at self-defense mechanisms. It could be understood by seeing how she maintained her faint soul after being attacked by Dantalion. She became blank afterwards though. For her to be in a state where Myung couldn't even do anything. It seemed like this was her limit. There was no piece of memory left. From what Myung could tell, Yunxi's soul had already reached a limit. When the Rain Clan's castle was built, she was also there. By seeing how she mentioned the Elursigo, it seemed she also knew of their existence. But, through her self-defense mechanism, it made her forget them all. It meant that it was information she knew, but wanted to erase. It also implied that the memory shouldn't be recalled. He was lucky. If Myung didn't pull out the last remnants of the memory that faintly existed, it would have all been erased. I must participate in the banquet. All the important people gathered at that place. There would be more people who would know about the Elursigo. Also, it seemed like he needed to break the Elursigo's seal in order to understand what Yunxi was talking about. Chapter 190, The Banquet, 3. Translation, Te. Edit, Sefter. Of course, he had no intention of leaving Seo Yunxi like that. It's a good body. She was a woman that had become known as the Dark Commander. Her body was now old and weak, but it would be a different story if he made her an undead. Since his Art of Death skill reached the S rank, the strength of her prime could be restored intact. In any case, if he didn't stretch out his hand, she would soon become a complete idiot and die. She had not been there in the past when Myung had been active. She had already died and her skeleton had become dust. However, he'd never made an undead from a living subject before. Usually, he would make people that were just on the brink of death into living corpses, but presently, Dark Commander Seo Yunxi was not greatly injured. But he had a good feeling. Having tried many kinds of extremes, Myung was continuously increasing his limits. He noticed his changes, and he also knew they were leading him in the right direction. So, Myung was no longer scared of change. When he had just returned, he was merely an awakened killer. He turned his attention to the demon gods because he grew tired of killing people. But now his goal was clear. He was clearly aware of what he had to do, and the reasons for which he was alive. Seo Yunxi, look at my eyes. Myung unleashed all his power. Ruhyumbal. The entire palace began to shake. The intangible energy that poured out of Myung was extremely distinct and overwhelming. Seo Yunxi, who had fainted, opened her eyes involuntarily. Then her body trembled. She was sealing herself and erasing her memory. She was now in a state closely resembling an idiot. A clean soul was like a kind of mirror, reflecting everything that was seen. All she could do was open her mouth and make a small scream. Myung forcibly seized her soul. Then, he started to create. Soul exploitation was the inherent skill of the Death Lord class. Even when his general skills ranked up, this didn't increase. Unfortunately, soul exploitation was not something that could be used often. So, the rank hadn't gone up. However, when the understanding of a soul that had already reached this stage and personally recreating a soul were combined, it had caused a steep rise in the rank. However, Myung had no intention of exploiting and absorbing Seo Yunxi's soul. The border of life and death. He merely wanted something that stood on that border. The art of death. After confirming that her soul had been completely subjugated by him, Myung used art of death. Soon, black air began to spread out from Myung's entire body and quietly devour Seo Yunxi. I don't need it. Myung immediately refused. The Masters of Darkness would try to turn Myung into their successor however they could. However, Myung now understood them to some degree. They ended up being defeated. They had become the Masters of Darkness as they were defeated. So, they wanted an absolute being that could never be defeated. Myung was a person that was optimized for those desires. However, I have not been defeated. It was the same. Myung had no thoughts of being defeated, not even once. He would only win. To do so, he needed to completely walk his path alone. They had only laid Myung's foundation. He could not grow up in their arms forever like a baby bird. Muyong personally sculpted and created her skills. If her level of death was insufficient, his power was enough to fill the gap. Muyong rammed the entirety of the power of death that he had into Xiao Yunxi's body. There, he added a sacred flame. Diablo's power was mixed in, Hai's flame symbolic of both life and death. Ruoar. Xiao Yunxi's body was burnt. She was swallowed by the fire. However, this flame was like a caterpillar's cocoon. Shedding her skin. She was shedding her cocoon in order to make beautiful wings. The black flame burnt and reconstructed Xiao Yunxi's body. No less than 5 times. She became younger each time she shed her skin. Little by little, she recovered the image of when she was in her prime. And finally, when she finished shedding her skin for the 5th time. Name, Xiao Yunxi. Level, 550. Type, Chaotic. Strength, 520, Agility, 605, Stamina, 510. Intelligence, 440, Wisdom, 440, Magical Resistance, 500. Inherent Tier 15 Shadow Ability, 510. Current successor to Zero Innocence. Potential to use a top mysterious technique to run on wind. Excellent camouflage. Unparalleled knife of the 12 stars. Destroyer of all battle formations. Supreme command skills. Chance of growing by soul assimilation. She was strong. Firstly, her agility was over 600. After passing 500, a difference of 1 point was significant, so if hers was 600, nothing more needed to be said. In terms of agility, at least, she was superior to Muyong. She was able to achieve this absurd ability because she had recovered the strength of her prime and had been further strengthened after shedding her skin 5 times. Xiao Yunxi's face was certainly tinged with color. She looked somewhat cold, but she was a typical Asian beauty with black bobbed hair. Also, finding out she was an undead certainly would not be easy. Her heart was still beating. "Are you my master?" Muyong nodded his head. Then, Xiao Yunxi grinned. It was a freshness that could not be found in any other undead. Xiao Yunxi knelt. She put her head to the floor in the typical posture of obedience. Then, she looked up and spoke while looking around. "My memory is not intact. I only remember that I was Dark Commander Xiao Yunxi and that this place was my house. I pray that my skills and remaining memories will be helpful to you, Master." She was definitely different. It didn't seem as if she had a simple mentality like an undead. At the very least, she was the closest to a human being among all the normal undead Muyong had made. The corners of Muyong's mouth tilted upwards. The first challenge. The first step was a success. Without anyone's help or advice, he had made his own way. Now, Muyong was completely able to step forward. Bango was in shock. 2 people came out of the palace. Banya's flawless exit was fortunate but not surprising. The problem was the person that followed behind him. Godmother. Godmother, who had lost her sanity, was back. Bango's pupils shook tremendously. In addition, Godmother looked like she had in Bango's first memories. Her old and sick appearance had disappeared, leaving only a beautiful and young one. How was this possible? Xiao Yunxi disappeared for a moment. Then, she appeared in front of Bango. Bango stumbled because he was unable to read her expression, but Xiao Yunxi didn't care. "I heard it from Banya. The clan is a major wreck." She sent him an incredibly cold look. Clan leader Bango's entire body trembled. Soon, she spoke again. "Now that I have returned, I will rebuild from the foundation. I will not permit arguments." Dark Commander Xiao Yunxi. She had taken an active part in the war with the Demon Kings in the past, and had erected the command clan on her own. She also had a presence that caused her to naturally be called a female general. A woman like that had returned to the command clan as an enormous typhoon. The original clan leader, Xiao Yunxi, was back. The rumor quickly spread. Something no one could have foreseen. Additionally, she had recovered the strength of her prime. Her gaze had become colder, and she had become more beautiful than in pictures or photographs. As soon as she returned, Muyong, as Banya, was declared as the true successor of the Command clan. Even the great Banjung was like a frightened mouse in front of Xiao Yunzi. The name Xiao Yunzi was that strong. Although she had been locked away, the fact that she had taken possession of that incredibly huge royal palace by herself was a testament to her power. Now that Xiao Yunzi was there, no one could touch Muyong. In the Command clan, at least. However, the clan finances had already been declining. I can't believe the clan is this weak. What have you been doing all this time? Xiao Yunzi's expression wasn't good. At least the memories that ruled the clan were still there. In the early days when she built the clan, its power came close to the Rain clans. Now, though, it had crumbled away beyond comparison. Xiao Yunzi was extremely displeased with this condition. At this time, Muyong was willing to throw away money readily. Numerous B-grade talismans. They were part of the more than 10,000 pages in the slush fund Muyong had robbed as the great thief. However, 10,000 B-grade talismans were enough to stop the immediate decline of the clan. Even combining all of you would not be equal to one of the successor. The rumor that Xiao Yunzi cherished Banya spread even more. There were many that wondered where the talismans came from, but Muyong remained consistently silent. They were illegal funds anyway. Who would proudly reveal the source of that? There is a lot left. Even though he used 10,000 talismans, the remainder was several times more. The rest of the money would be used when he returned to his real territory. Still, this led to Muyong becoming the true successor. The return of Xiao Yunzi, the original clan leader, and Banya the heir was not only the Command clan's problem. The heads of the other large clans, who knew Xiao Yunzi's true character, were also affected. They started to pay attention to the Command clan. This was because they knew how great the things Xiao Yunzi achieved by herself were. The banquet, which used to be a place to moderately meet face to face, smile, and make conversation, turned into a huge gathering that attracted everyone's attention. Xiao Yunzi and Banya were at the center of that. With the maximum splendor. Muyong dressed in glamorous clothing and jewelry. It was his first time doing this, but it didn't feel difficult to adjust to. A royal palace that seemed to rise to the sky. It was an enormous place with many landscaped gardens that stretched for miles. While others rode in coaches led by 12 horses, Muyong rode in a large coach led by 7 blazing bone dragons. Kwaaak! Screech! The 7 bone dragons arrived in the garden, uttering horrible shrieks. All the surrounding birds fled, and even the insects went silent. Meanwhile, they caught the attention of everyone who had been in the garden enjoying the banquet. Their eyes widened in an instant. It was inconceivable that he would come by dragon. Their gazes were mixed with astonishment, anxiety, and jealousy. There were people who, outside of horses, reared powerful monsters and used them as mounts, but no one was able to come in a coach led by bone dragons. Kreaaak! The door opened. Step! Muyong walked out. It was a flamboyant introduction.